To have the Prime Minister of the country to be found guilty of breaking the law, to aid very, very powerful people in writing a piece of legislation that existed only for that company. It was written for one purpose, to get them a get out of jail card. And then to have a campaign involving so many key people in the Liberal government to put pressure on the Attorney General and the independent prosecutor is not acceptable. Either we have the rule of law in this country or we don't. Right now, he's bound by the Conflict of Interest Act and he's been found guilty. We see that there's a pattern of interference by his office and the Privy Council that interrupted 9 potential witnesses to give testimony. We need to know who those 9 witnesses were. We need to know how extent was the interference and the obstruction in the work of the Ethics Commissioner.
I can't imagine a country where the Prime Minister can break the law and not admit to it, not apologize to it, but that, quite frankly, somehow Canadians are going to accept. Is this the future now of Canada? That this is the bar that we're setting, that we're saying the highest office in the land, that individual can break the law. The Prime Minister of Canada has broken the law. This matters. This is about the Prime Minister trying to corrupt the Attorney General's office. And we can't accept that breaking the law in Canada is now okay for the Prime Minister.
Reporting to parliamentarians and to all Canadians that their Prime Minister broke the law in improperly attempting to influence the Attorney General, quote, in many ways. It confirmed Canadians' decisions and suspicions and much more.
It's important to recap why we're here. SNC-Lavalin is accused of over $100 million of fraud and bribery, accused of stealing over $100 million from among the poorest people in the world. Instead of going to trial, the company convinced the Prime Minister to change the criminal code, allowing alleged corporate criminals to get off of a trial by signing a deal to apologize and promise never to do it again. The Prime Minister passed that in an omnibus bill and then demanded his Attorney General extend such a deal against the earlier decision of the top prosecutor. She refused, so he fired her. She spoke out, so he kicked her out and shut down the numerous parliamentary inquiries into the matter. Since then, he has told us, wait for the Ethics Commissioner to issue his verdict. And so we all waited, assuming that when that verdict came, we'd all be able to hear about it right here in the Ethics Committee. Here today, we will decide if, in fact, that will happen. We know that there's a lot more to this story. The Ethics Commissioner has not been able to tell. At least 9 witnesses were prevented by the Trudeau government from telling their full story because of a government-imposed gag order under the guise of cabinet confidentiality. There are many mysteries that we need to unravel in this matter, and only by hearing witnesses can we do so. One of them is this famous 9,000 jobs claim. You know, most of SNC-Lavalin's jobs in this country are for construction work done in this country. They're going to be building a north-south transit project here in Ottawa. Well, they can't build that in Hong Kong or in Munich and then drop it out of a helicopter on the nation's capital. That work will have to be done here. The headquarters must stay in Montreal until the year 2024, according to a loan agreement with the Quebec pension plan. The CEO of the company said that the company is not moving anywhere, and we know that leaving Canada would not exempt the company from prosecution or conviction. So we've tried to ask the government where this claim about jobs has come from. In fact, Ms. May asked some of the best questions on this matter. She asked Mr. Wernick, in the public interest then, Mr. Wernick, in preparing advice to Cabinet, what work did you do to assess the threat of jobs? Did you look at the commitments made to the government of Quebec not to move the headquarters as mentioned? Did you look at the current financial status of SNC-Lavalin? Did you, in fact, have an independent assessment of whether there would be any impact on jobs from a decision to proceed to the Director of Public Prosecutions had decided to proceed? Response, no. because the file was entirely in the carriage of the then Minister of Justice. Apparently, the Justice Department now does jobs assessments. Gerald Butts had a different story when Miss May asked the same question. She asked, is there any evidence that jobs were actually going to be at stake by letting this go through the courts and letting the independent director of public prosecutions and the Attorney General do their jobs? Gerald Butts, I can't recall anything specific. He also said, my understanding from the department, that the jobs claim was his understanding from the Department of Finance briefings. But I have to say it's been a long time. So now we're claiming that the Department of Finance has proof of this 9,000 jobs claim. So let's turn over to the Finance Minister. Well, in the Ethics Commissioner's report, I quote, when asked if he, Morneau, or his office had undertaken a study or analysis of the economic impacts of the Director of Public Prosecution's decision, Morneau testified that none had been conducted. And then a reporter on March 7th asked the Prime Minister the following question. Both Mr. Wernick and Mr. Butts testified they had no direct evidence that 9,000 potential that 9,000 potential job loss. Did you have any evidence of 9,000 jobs being lost? Response, we had heard representations from various sources, including the company itself, that this was an issue of deep concern to them and that it could potentially have consequences as dire as the company having to leave Canada altogether. Now, you notice he didn't provide any evidence, but he did claim that the company might leave the country altogether. Well, let's turn to the Ethics Commissioner's report on that. Top Trudeau advisor, Mr. Bouchard, notes from the same October 23rd, 2018 meeting with senior officials of the Privy Council office show that they also discussed SNC's Board of Directors' potential plan to move the corporate headquarters, but the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec would not let that happen. In other words, Mr. Trudeau's office knew in October, months before he made the claim that the headquarters would leave, that eventuality was impossible. So given that this was not about jobs, the most important question I want to ask is what motivated this? What on God's green earth would compel a prime minister to pass a law at the request of one company, exempting corporate criminals from prosecution, put pressure on his attorney general to overturn his top prosecutor, and then fire her when she refused to do so, given that it was not about jobs? We know that SNC-Lavalin gave $100,000 of illegal donations to the Liberal Party. We know they swarmed Parliament Hill and the PMO with lobbyists. There was a revolving door between this government and SNC-Lavalin. We need to know the real motive for helping protect this company.
Well, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is dealing with a growing scandal tonight. It involves what he allegedly told a top official to do about a major company involved in a corruption investigation. Correspondent Jillian Turner picks up the story from outside the Canadian Embassy in Washington.
I and my staff always acted appropriately and professionally.
That's Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, continuing to resist a groundswell of calls for his resignation. His office treading water as a scandal that erupted inside his cabinet now threatens to drown the entire administration.
Our government will always focus on jobs.
But Trudeau is holding fast to his main line of defense.
My job as Prime Minister has always been to stand up for Canadians.
Trudeau's own former Attorney General and Justice Minister claims his office launched a consistent and sustained campaign over many months to get her to drop charges against a Canadian company. SNC-Lavalin is one of the world's largest construction and engineering firms, and Jody Wilson-Raybould planned to slap its leadership with bribery and fraud charges. In testimony before the Canadian Parliament Wednesday, Wilson-Raybould outlined what she calls Trudeau's bold-faced intimidation tactics.
There were many other inappropriate conversations and attempts at political interference that occurred. I believe where it got even more heightened were what I described as the veiled threats.
If true, it's a dramatic fall from grace for Trudeau, a young, energetic, liberal prime minister who grabbed the world's attention a decade ago, thanks in large part to his easy rapport with world leaders, high-profile friendships with President Obama, and spats with President Trump over free trade. Now, Trudeau's awful week is poised to get worse as Canada's Conservative Party sharpens its knives.
It's a textbook case of government corruption, with those at the very top of the Prime Minister's office implicated.
Trudeau's office told Fox News just a short while ago, quote, "We completely disagree with the former Attorney General's characterization of the events."
The Prime Minister of Canada has broken the law. This matters. This is about the Prime Minister trying to corrupt the Attorney General's office. And we can't accept that breaking the law in Canada is now okay for the Prime Minister.